So let's talk about what's happening in the Middle East because the conflict matters more than you think. So a few days ago, I joined a webinar organized by the organization FrenchFounders. I've been a member for many years, and the rep from FrenchFounders in the UAE, Lucie Duvivier, organized a conversation with Olivier Bariety. So Olivier is the CEO of Princeps Strategy and he has extensive background in military and diplomacy. The audience of the webinar was really global. That tells you how much people care about that topic, whether they were from Europe, Canada, obviously the Middle East, everywhere in between. And everyone was trying to make sense about what is unfolding. And when you look at the situation, what is really striking for me is that's the level of confusion, like information overload, contradictions, strong opinions. It's a bit difficult to have analysis that make any sense. And in the middle of it, it's very simple. Most people are reacting to headlines. They don't really understand the system behind. So before we go further and I tell you more about this webinar, I really want to put the emphasis on the fact that what follows really reflect the analysis that was kindly shared by Olivier and his team. But, as I said, they really bring deep expertise, on the ground experience, but like any geopolitical view, it remains an interpretation. This is not an absolute truth. So as always, use your own critical thinking and the mosaic theory to make your own opinion. So let's step back because what's happening here is not just what some could see as a regional conflict. It is really a stress test of the global order. And there are three layers, and these are layers that most of us are missing. So if you just look at one of them, you might also miss the big picture. So you have a visible layer, which is Sunni versus Shia. And yes, the religious divide matters. More importantly, when you really look at it, the Sunni world itself is quite fragmented. You have the Qatar-Turkey axis, you have the Saudi, UAE, Egypt bloc, and then you have Pakistan by itself that is playing its own game with a very strong card, which is the nuclear card. And this fragmentation, that creates opportunities for Iran. On the other side, you have the so-called Shia crescent, and it is weakening and it is under pressure. So translation, this is not a binary conflict. It is a fragmented chessboard. So that is the first visible layer. Then you have the strategic layer, which is US, Israel, and the nuclear question. So at the core of this conflict really sits one uncomfortable truth. Nuclear capability is the ultimate insurance policy because people that have nuclear capability, they don't fight each other directly, and that the countries that don't have nuclear capabilities, well, they become the battlefields by proxy. So that's something really to keep in mind. So Israel sees Iran as an existential threat. And, the US acts accordingly, not just tactically, but structurally. So this is not an escalation. This is preemption. Again, think about the nuclear card really as this strategic layer. And then you have that hidden layer, which is always usually the most important, or at least as important, and that is US versus China. And this is really where it gets interesting because China depends heavily on Iranian oil, over 50%. Disrupt Iran and you pressure China. So at the same time, Russia and China are not stepping in military in the conflict. So you can see as well that this so-called global soft alliance is showing its limit. So this conflict, again, is also about controlling energy flows and therefore power. So keep in mind these three layers when you look at this conflict or actually any other conflict in the world. There is always way more than meet the eye. So what is coming next? And I would say, spoiler alert, we don't see a very quick resolution here. This will last, not necessarily as an open conflict, but as sustained instability. So why? Well, first, Iran benefits from dragging this out. Second, Western public opinion, like it weakens quickly and it weakens over time. And the third point is that even if the fighting stops, the tensions will not. So you can see three scenarios that are emerging from Iran. The first is escalation and endurance. The second is an internal regime change. And the third is a power shift within the system, meaning military versus religious leadership. So none of these are really clean exits. So what does it mean in terms of economic, and I mean, the shockwave has already started, and we tend to think that the impact comes later. It really doesn't, it's already here. So if you look at the immediate pressure points, obviously the energy, it is, again, it seems obvious, but very often we underestimate the second order effects. Obviously, if you look at energy, what does it mean for the rest of the manufacture world and thinking data center, thinking about all of that. The second is supply chains. We've been speaking a lot, obviously, in the news about the Strait of Hormuz. That is a huge risk for global disruption. We're already seeing it now. Food security, that is less obvious, but it is very, very critical. Inflation and pressure on margin, but also investment slowdown. So that is definitely something that has a very impactful slowdown on the economy. And you can see one surprising shift, I guess, from the conflict is that Russia is quietly but surely becoming relevant again as an energy alternative, not politically, not publicly, but structurally, because the world hates a vacuum and it fills it quickly. So there is something interesting about data as a new battlefield, because for the first time, you can see data centers that are becoming targets. This is no longer just physical warfare. It is digital infrastructure warfare, which obviously raises the question that most companies are not ready to answer. Where are your data and how vulnerable are they? Cloud is actually not a strategy. Redundancy is a data strategy. And so what does all of that mean for business leaders? So let's get a bit more practical and also uncomfortable, because resilience is no longer a buzzword, it's really operational right now. So let's talk about the new playbook. So first, cyber is no longer an option. So if you as an entrepreneur or as an executive is not putting resources on cyber, you're exposed. I mean, that's just the reality. Second, cash is a strategy. You need liquidity. It gives you survival. It gives you optionality. So cash is king. Diversification is not just a nice to have anymore. You need operational diversification, you need geographical diversification, you need supply diversification. I would say diversification, everything. And you also need to build your organizational sovereignty. Who holds decision power? What happens if they're unavailable? So these are questions that are important, one layer down from just the classical succession planning. You also want to rethink your dependency model. Again, the cloud, supply chains, key partners. So now everything is a potential point of failure. So here is a final thought. So what is happening in the Middle East is not an isolated crisis. It is a preview of a world where conflicts are hybrid, alliances are very fluid, and economic and geopolitical systems are intertwined, and where certainty is gone, but the patterns are still readable. So the leaders who will navigate this best are not the ones with the strongest opinions. They're the ones who are able to understand complexity, to think in systems, to prepare before clarity arrives. I see that big challenge with organization, this need for 100% certainty before making any type of small decisions. There is no certainty, only uncertainty. And I would say lack of clarity is the rule now. Because again, by the time things get clear, you're usually too late. So thank you so much for being with me. I hope you enjoy this edition of my newsletter. Again, my name is Peggy van der Plas. Not sure I mentioned that. If you like it, please click the like button. But more importantly, I hope this gave you a good perspective on what some think of what is happening in the Middle East. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.